Hello, everyone. I am happy to introduce the man without whom our little SCI island over there might have been a zoo. I'm happy to introduce Christopher Kaiser, who is the program manager of the Shared Course Initiative, which connects less commonly taught language classrooms at Columbia, Cornell, and Yale using high-definition video conferencing. His area of interests include second language pedagogy, distance learning, presence in the distance environment, interinstitutional collaboration, and language learning advocacy. He will be speaking on leveraging presence, rethinking the affordances of distance environment in language teaching. I give you Dr. Kaiser.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me just adjust this here and turn this on. Okay, so in this talk, I'm going to speak about how interinstitutional collaborations using distance technology are an increasingly useful and productive way of addressing issues related to the provision and sustainability of languages, especially the less commonly taught languages. So I will speak first about the landscape of technology in the 21st century generally, from my point of view. Then I'll discuss the situation of the less commonly taught languages in U.S. universities today. And finally, I will share a process of reasoning that led Columbia, Cornell, and Yale to establish and iteratively refine a distance collaboration for these languages called the Shared Course Initiative. So I'd like to open my talk with a few questions about the practice of daily life in the 21st century. Think for a moment about this question. What percentage of your life is lived online in the year 2019? Is it 30%? 50%? A second question is, how often is your attention focused solely on what is physically in your environment? And to what extent is your attention punctuated by a continuous toggling back and forth between virtual spaces and those right in front of you? When is the last time you checked your email? How many times have you checked your email since I started talking? Now, think about what percentage of your life was lived online 10 years ago in 2009. Was it less? How about 1999, or if you're old enough, 1989, like me? I think that most of us would agree that the experience of everyday life has become significantly digitized in the last 20 years in ways whose meaning we haven't fully grasped. This change in daily life and the ways in which we focus our attention have been channeled through communications products and online services that are meant to have simple user interfaces, but which are actually quite complex behind the scenes. In fact, we have learned in the last few years exactly how products like Facebook strive to monetize our attention and to keep its users in what former Facebook executive Chamath Palihapitiya has called a short-term dopamine-driven feedback loop. Anyone who has used Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat or any app with a little floating red notification number knows what this feels like. So we could say that mobile technologies both mediate and actively shape our experience of the world today. This has many implications, both positive and negative, and it presents both challenges and opportunities. I think, first and foremost, we should consider what the rise of world-spanning information networks and their attendant technologies allow us to do versus what they typically lead us to do and what they acculturate us to do. In fact, the dominant technologies of daily life all come with their own default states. They are meant to be used in a specific way. Hardly anyone questions the default mode of use. Very few people crack open their iPhones and tinker with the insides. But the problem with default states of use is that they give rise to default experiences, default modes of thinking, and default cultures. Think about a person who opts out of social media. This person is probably viewed as a pariah of some sort, a frightening figure to be avoided. The rise of a tech-oriented default state-driven common sense has some pretty observable negative effects generally, and on the study of languages in particular. In today's language classroom, it is common to see every student with an open laptop and a smartphone on the desk, attending to note-taking, surfing the web, and also a little bit to what is happening in the classroom. However, learning a language is a cognitively demanding process that requires sustained attention, negotiating meaning, and assimilating new structures. And these devices, if not appropriately channeled by a thoughtful instructor, can be more of a distraction than a benefit. Less observable in an immediate sense is the way in which the rise of a tech-oriented default perspective on the world has hollowed out what was widely viewed as one of the main reasons for studying a language, namely, to learn to communicate with individuals from other places and cultures. Today, we only need to use English, one might think, because we can just use Google Translate to negotiate any foreign language situation. Of course, as language instructors and professionals, we know that this is not true, that Google Translate doesn't get you very far beyond the superficial level of interaction. But it is a perception that we must now counter, a perception which in the past did not exist. It is not possible or desirable to resist these changes. One must transform, innovate, and adapt from within the new context. This is particularly urgent when it comes to language teaching and learning, which can easily slip into its own default state, which is the recreation of a world frozen in time, typically somewhere around the year 1992, which is increasingly dissonant from and inapplicable to students' real-life experiences, as other speakers have discussed today. And as I say this, I'm aware that some language instructors have taken the bull by the horns and have innovated, adapted, and transformed in truly admirable ways, some of which we heard already. So the crucial step that we as language teachers need to make in order to adapt to this new context is to challenge the primacy of the 21st century default state and the default habits of mind that they engender. Or to put it a different way, any positive integration of technology and language study can only come about through deliberate design and reasoning from pedagogy. On the other hand, acceptance of communication technology's default state will only result in negative experiences. The reason that I've placed such an emphasis on engaging with today's communications technologies in such a cautious, critical way is because the situation of diminished enrollments that is the topic of our symposium is one that seems like it could easily be addressed with technology. And this is especially true for the less commonly taught languages. Or I think another way of putting this as a question that is shaped by the default wisdom of our era when it comes to less commonly taught languages or languages that are becoming less commonly taught languages, which we think of as commonly taught languages, is why don't we collaborate and why don't we just use Skype? So why don't we just use Skype? To begin to answer this question and everything that stands behind it, let's first look at the situation that causes it to arise so naturally. The nationwide decrease in language enrollments indicated in the 2016 MLA Census of Enrollments in Languages Other than English in the United States institutions of higher education has, I think I did that not as well as Lee, has garnered significant attention because it shows that languages such as French, German, and Spanish have lost students nationwide. However, the issues that these commonly taught languages are now facing are issues that the less commonly taught languages have faced for quite some time. The report on the census defines less commonly taught languages as all languages not included in the top 15, which are these. On the other hand, the National Council for the Teaching of the Less Commonly Taught Languages defines less commonly taught languages, or LCTLs, as, quote, all languages other than English and the commonly taught European languages of German, French, and Spanish. So the range of what constitutes a less commonly taught language differs. The MLA report also points to some of the major challenges that less commonly taught languages face. Quote, LCTL course offerings can be fragile and transitory since the programs tend to be small and may depend on a single instructor. In addition, they may not be taught every semester, and as a result, our census may miss them, unquote. I would like to add that some other challenges that less commonly taught languages face include maintaining adequate student enrollments over time, finding and training qualified instructors, giving resources to these instructors to allow them to offer the language sustainably, i.e. pay them enough, and give instructors an institutional home, since they are often the sole instructor of that language. While these are certainly significant challenges, one notable aspect of less commonly taught language offerings generally is that they tend to correspond to departmental strengths and areas of research interest within a university. To offer an example, in the case of Columbia and Cornell, Cornell is very strong in South and Southeast Asian languages, offering Khmer, Burmese, Thai, Sinhala, Nepalese, and Bengali. Columbia, on the other hand, has a particular strength in Slavic languages, with Ukrainian, Russian, Czech, Polish, and Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian. These differing situations are linked to institutional history. It is unlikely that either of these universities would rapidly develop new, robust programmatic strengths in the same cluster of less commonly taught language offerings as the other. In other words, lictals, and especially a subgroup of lictals known as the almost never taught languages, tend not to overlap between universities, even as they are the most fragile of all university programs. So there are many obvious benefits to engaging in an interinstitutional collaboration with lictals. Often, lictal instructors are sole language instructors, as I mentioned, operating without a robust network of fellow teachers engaged in teaching the same language to the same cohort of students. And by participating in a community of practice whose core purpose is to engage with the task of distance teaching in the context of a distance consortium, these instructors are more readily brought into an intellectual community, and by sharing a common mission of course sharing, they have a natural affinity toward mutual support. Not only do instructors of less commonly taught languages experience the burdens of an often solitary effort, students of these languages often find that they move through the study of the language without a significant cohort of peers with whom to share the affective experiences of language learning, nor do they have a variety of fellow learners to serve as conversation partners. This is particularly acute in the case of heritage learners of less commonly taught languages, for whom language study is a way of opening a door to a heritage culture and a community of individuals who share this same experience. A distance collaboration between two or more universities allows students of less commonly taught languages to connect with one another and allow for a larger community of language learners to come into existence. One final reason for which a collaboration across distance can be useful for lictals especially is that different universities in different areas have access to different resources that can be accessed by students at all sites that are participating in the consortium. So if the geographic distance is not too great, as is the case with the Shared Course Initiative, it may be possible for students and instructors to engage in a meaningful collective activity together on a special occasion. And I'd like to give one example of how this has worked with the Shared Course Initiative. Is Professor Sonam Sering in the audience? So he teaches the modern colloquial Tibetan class, and he did an activity that I think is illustrative of how a consortial arrangement can take advantage of local affordances. So New York City has a large Tibetan diaspora community, and this is a little bit less the case at Yale and Cornell. And recently, the students of modern colloquial Tibetan at all three sites participated in the Tibetan New Year festival called Losar. In the Columbia classroom, where the language is taught face-to-face, the students planted wheatgrass, and the remote students were responsible for monitoring its growth over the course of the week. Thus, the unmarked space of the classroom was given a cultural inflection and became the site of a Tibetan cultural practice. On the day of Losar itself, several Tibetan language students from Cornell and Yale traveled to Columbia in the evening to take part in the event, which included a catered dinner from Lhasa Fast Food, a local Tibetan restaurant, and the celebration of the New Year according to traditional customs. Tibetan scholars and members of the Tibetan diaspora community were also in attendance. The event drew students who were taking the language for heritage purposes, and in many cases was the first time the students had experienced this ritual, despite being of Tibetan heritage. It also included L2 students who had acquired an interest in Tibetan language and culture at the university, and for whom this event was the first authentic cultural experience of Tibet in which they were able to participate. all of this to say, there are many reasons why it makes sense for distance collaborations in less commonly taught languages to come into existence. And in fact, the particular less commonly taught language landscape is what allowed Columbia, Cornell, and Yale to receive a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to set up such a collaboration starting in 2012, the Shared Course Initiative. And we were funded for 5 and then 6 years, but the idea was that we would transition away from the funding and build a sustainable program, which I'm happy to report occurred last year. And this program is funded by all 3 schools. So this is sort of the Shared Course Initiative. I want to see it as a kind of example. So I want to share with you the temporally extended process of reasoning that we followed in order to build the Shared Course Initiative. I hope to show how at every turn we have applied pedagogically minded first principles in order to avoid technology privileging default states that would have locked us into an unsustainable program that would not have met our specific needs. This process of reasoning has given rise to concepts that may be useful to you in an immediate sense if you perhaps wanted to set up your own interinstitutional collaboration for the sharing of less commonly taught languages, or, as I much more fervently hope, that you will see this process of reasoning as emblematic of how to harness a world historical phenomenon like the digitization of everyday life, which on one hand may have contributed to a decrease in enrollments, but on the other, which can be meaningfully adapted into a tool that can help to strengthen and sustain language programs. So when we started in 2012, we had already identified a few key objectives, and these guided our decision-making process. These objectives were related to the specific parameters, needs, resources, and requirements of our 3 institutions. However, it is important to keep in mind that your institutions may have different needs, different requirements, and different resources. So our objectives were synchronous, live, high-definition video conferencing, classroom-to-classroom real-time interaction as opposed to online or asynchronous models. And these classes were meant to be credit-bearing academic year courses. So, in other words, we wanted an experience that approached the experience of the face-to-face classroom. And so we sought to deploy a kind of skeuomorphism. We weren't having students become avatars or engage in text only. They were synchronous and in real time. And as we thought about it, in an idealized setup, the screen was meant to seem like a window on the wall of the classroom through which students at other institutions would interact in a very natural way. And so in 2012, the SCI, the Shared Course Initiative, was faced with choosing a technological approach. And because any technological approach that you choose for a consortium requires a significant initial investment of both funds and time and thought, we knew that we had to choose wisely. And so this is kind of the schema that we considered. And I can talk very briefly about these different parameters. So hardware versus software. Hardware is a video conferencing system that is installed by AV Installer. It's a specialized computer that runs video conferencing. Software is basically it does all of these functions, but on a regular computer and with perhaps a subscription. So these are services like Zoom or Skype. And then the sort of binary of classroom or distributed. So classroom is the students come to a classroom and are connecting to other classrooms. Distributed would be more of Brady Bunch model, so images of the students on a screen and each student is in their own square. So what we chose was a classroom model using hardware, and this has advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are it has the highest level of quality, and it has the highest degree of social norms and expectations for participating in a language class. The disadvantages is that it's expensive and it's difficult to maintain and use. And so that's part of the reason why I have a job. I have to make sure that it continues to work. However, this schema, I think, is very applicable in 2012, 2013. Now it's starting to change a bit, and software solutions are beginning to edge up into the upper left quadrant and are beginning to be better. And I expect in the next 5 years, if we were to renew the shared course initiative, we may transition to a software model. And what this would do is it would really place the emphasis on selecting classroom versus distributed, because the software model would be the mechanism through which either a classroom or distributed model would come about. So we would have to say, we choose the classroom model. I know that you as a student could join via Zoom from your bathtub, but you're not allowed to. That's something that we would have to enforce and something that we would choose. So yeah, I discussed the classroom-based model. But we realized that technology was only one piece of the puzzle. And we realized that we needed to spend a lot of time with instructors especially, but also with students, getting them accustomed to this new way of language study, this new form of language study. And what we thought about a lot, or what I think about now, is that when an instructor becomes a teacher through the shared course initiative, there's kind of a spectrum of possible reactions. And on the one hand, what I've noticed is that instructors who have spent more of their lives in the pre-digital world may tend to shut down or get nervous or uncomfortable when they enter into the shared space of instruction, which, let me just flash forward a bit. It looks kind of like this. On the other hand, digital natives, people who have a great facility with communications technology, can very easily enter into a relatively superficial default state of use where it works and they can get going immediately, but they never really explore the possibilities and affordances of the format. So in our efforts, we seek to explore preconceived notions and to say, this doesn't work in the way that Skype works, this is something different. I think it's also really helpful for instructors to spend quite a bit of time in the classroom just seeing how their body moves, how it feels, how they can position themselves, how they'll move between teaching students who are physically present and students who are manifested on the screen. And this is a process that develops and evolves over time, both in terms of the instructor's comfort level and ease, but also in terms of how, over time, the instructors change the configuration of their course from one that is based on the face-to-face version of that class into one that is optimized for the distance format. And because doing this involves a certain degree of upfront work, there can be a bit of a barrier at the beginning. But once they've done that work, then they have a lot of material that they can use again or adapt and change, but without having to do all of that work again, and in fact to do less work the next time they teach the class. So this is something that we try to continue to follow them with as they progress over the different semesters. So over the course of the 7 years, and certainly over the time that I've been involved in the project, which is 3 years, we've thought deeply about what happens in the shared course initiative on a day-to-day basis. And we have tried to develop a conceptual vocabulary for the phenomena that emerged from this unique context. Doing so, I believe, has significantly improved our program, because once you put a name to something, as our president has shown, you gain some degree of control over it. So I want to share a few of these internally developed concepts, not just for people interested in thinking about distance collaborations, but also, again, as emblematic of how language teaching can and must enter into new domains and gain a toehold in them to remain relevant in the 21st century. So again, these are our own sort of internal concepts that I think about a lot, and I'm starting to run low on time, so I'm happy to speak at greater length about them in another context. So the first of these is what we call presence, and it's a concept with a long history. So anybody who is starting to teach a distance class is familiar with Garrison's notion of social presence, teaching presence, cognitive presence, which I won't go into here. But what I think about when I think of presence is kind of the active version of what is called attention in the sort of tech context. It's the feeling of I am here, I am attending to your emotions, your feelings. When I look at your image, I can tell not just that you're there, I can tell what you're feeling, I can tell whether you are happy that I'm saying a certain thing to you, or whether you are pretending to be happy. So these kind of levels of nuance in the way that you speak with another person. And I think that in these two images you see differing degrees of presence. So on the left, you have a class that's a little bit bigger, and so the degree of this type of presence is a little bit lower. The image of the students is a little smaller. Obviously, this is a problem you want to have because you want to have lots of students in your classes. On the right, you see that the two Yale students are the same size as they are in real life, and so you can really see their facial expressions, you can see their body language, and you can get a sense of them in a more sort of humanistic sense. And I really believe, from what I've observed, that this version of presence is very much, it's functionally a binary, even though it's technically a spectrum, because it appears to me that there's a threshold over which you can feel like you are getting that fellow feeling or that degree of presence, and below which you do not. And so as I circulate between the different distance classrooms, I'm always asking myself, is this class in presence? Is it in presence, or is it not? And if it's not, why? Typically because it's been zoomed out to the extent that the person is smaller. And I think about how far away you would have to be for visually you to appear that small. And so we want to avoid that. I think it's very important that we bring the visualized size of each person as close to the actual physical size that they are as possible, and that's what we try to do. Okay, so going a little more quickly, the second concept that I think about is modularity, and by that I mean when you have a video conferencing system installed in a room, AV installer puts it in. Typically they're installing these for corporate boardrooms, and they're maybe not thinking about how to do it for a language classroom. And so to the greatest extent that I can, I try to break apart the constituent pieces and put it in myself. I try to have the speakers in these smaller classrooms be aligned with the image of the person, and instead of having overhead speakers, for example, I prefer to have screens that are on stands as opposed to attached to the wall, so that we can move the space of the classroom and reconfigure it. So that's just what I mean by modularity. So leveraging affordances very quickly is, I'll just give one example. In this format, you have two large screens, and so you have the screen on the left, which typically has the computer content, and the screen on the right, which typically has the people. And so one affordance of this format is that the students at all sites can see the content on the computer equally and at this very large degree of scale. And so if you want to read a text, or you want to annotate something, or you want to attend to a specific visual object, then that's something you can do really easily through the shared course initiative in these classrooms that maybe in a face-to-face classroom you might not be able to do. And so if you lean into these kinds of affordances, then these can help combat some of the challenges that are associated with teaching in a distance format. System affect is, I would say, the way that everybody generally feels about how it's going and what it's like, and system affect is reduced or made not as good by an accretion of tiny failures. And so one of my jobs is to make sure that these don't happen, and that when they do happen, because they are, you have so many different points of failure between here and Yale, and between here and Cornell, is to manage the emotions of a tech breakdown, to go into the classroom if necessary and say, okay, we're having a little bit of an issue, but stand by, maybe converse on this topic for a moment, and we'll be right back. When an instructor, when a student is in the distance space, it can very easily spiral out into an emotional issue. So it's good to keep things smoothed over, and all of these little points of failure reduce the system affect, but points of success and points of excitement and enthusiasm, they increase the system affect, and this can be further increased by encouraging students to reflect on what they're able to do in this context. And speaking of students, I want to talk briefly about what we call construing the space of instruction. So what we don't want to have is to put all the burden on the teacher or the instructor to set up the 2- or 3-way space of instruction. We want to give the power and the responsibility to the students to do that, to make the call into the classroom, to align the cameras, and in doing so, we kind of lower the degree of hierarchy between student and teacher in a way that's productive. And it also helps everybody feel like they're part of this common effort to create the space in which the language instruction can occur. So these are just 5 concepts that we've thought about a lot and that are useful heuristics for us as we move throughout the day. So I am at the end of my time, and I wanted to simply close by saying that okay, so I'll just say that these are the languages that we've had over time. Right now we have, I think, 18 languages and 35 total courses between our 3 schools. And so what I was hoping to illustrate in this talk was not just what we did with a distance collaboration, but the way in which we have taken this tech landscape, this enrollment landscape, and the less commonly taught languages landscape, and thought about it and tried to think through it and tried to resist the default thinking that we encounter at every turn. Try to resist the question, why don't you just use Skype? Why don't you just make it magically happen? We have to think through this, and this is emblematic of how I think all of us can, as language professionals, can take on the 21st century challenges that are the cause of this symposium, but I believe can also be the way out of what we are construing as the crisis. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Hi. Thank you very much for that informative presentation. You just flipped through the last couple slides, and I saw on the back right there was one that said called challenges, and that's what my question was going to be. What sort of challenges did you face, and talk a little bit about what's the hard part about putting this together?
Sure. So I think that the most sort of schematic answer to your question is right here, and you can take a look at that. But I would say that it's really a question of changing a mindset and changing a culture, and saying that we're no longer, these 3 schools, we are collaborators, and technically we're competitors as well in different arenas, but here we are conceiving of the language classroom as a truly shared space, and that each student who's in this class, irrespective of their physical location and institutional belonging, is an equal student in that class. And so I think that the biggest challenge has been changing this culture, and this extends to all of the little minutia of getting this done. From the registrar understanding that they can register a student in this class, to aligning the different calendars between the different schools, which is a big logistical challenge, and some of my colleagues at Yale and Cornell who helped me do that are here today, and I thank them for that. Thank you. But yeah, I would say that that's the biggest challenge. But I'm happy to talk at greater length as well.
Can I have a follow-up?
Sure.
What did you... Thanks. Can I have a follow-up question?
Sure.
What did you do, or what's it like on the instructor side? Do you go through training for the instructors so that they're better at doing this, so that they're more informed? What kind of concrete workshops or whatever were professional development were done for the instructors?
Sure. So I'll give you my answer, but there are also 5 instructors here who are in the shared course initiative, and I'm sure they'd be happy to speak with you about this as well. So as part of our Mellon years, we did an annual workshop that was sort of scaffolded up from, basic introduction to the format to some more detailed and applied ways of teaching in this environment. Now that we're on an institutionally supported model, we have been doing that a little bit less, simply because the process of institutionalizing the SCI took so much of our energy and resources. However, we're going to have another workshop in the fall, and what we really want to do at that point is to have it be much less of a top-down type thing, and have the instructors share their experiences and share some of their better practices, I would say, and talk about what they've been able to do. Because what I've noticed in going between the different classes is that I feel like there's kind of a wheel and spoke situation going on, where I see what one person is doing, and they're often doing something totally amazing and innovative that the other people don't know about. And so I think that because this is kind of a new territory, it's also an open space of experimentation. And as I was speaking earlier about what Sonam did with the Tibetan New Year, I've seen all of our instructors innovate and develop ideas, not either in terms of content or in terms of how to use the technology, that I think is really amazing. For example, this year we discovered that a new smartboard that we installed has multi-touch capabilities. So you can easily zoom between different desktops, and one of our instructors has developed a whole curriculum based on using the smartboard. And so, this is a class that doesn't have a textbook, and with a group of other instructors, they developed basically a first semester textbook that is meant specifically for this distance language classroom and for the affordances of the large smartboard. So we would love for that instructor to present on what they did. And so, yeah, I think that, at the beginning there was a lot of theoretical and, experimental type instruction, but now I believe that we've matured to the point where we can really have it be a bottom-up type training and knowledge sharing event.
Thanks. Hi. Thanks so much. This was very interesting. I always find this initiative fascinating. But if I'm allowed to play the devil's advocate for a minute, in terms of policies within institutions, as someone who teaches a less commonly taught language, I can see what happens if a university decides, and I'm not talking necessarily about ours, that, okay, you have 3 students in each class, 4 students, we don't need an instructor for this, we can use the shared course initiative between Yale, Cornell, and Columbia, and since they all together amount to 12, 13 students, we will just have one instructor doing it. How do you see this working in terms of policy making within the university, in terms of affecting the numbers of students that we require of instructors to have in their classroom, and whether that was something that you thought of when creating this?
Sure, I think we thought about it when creating it, and we think about it all the time now. Because what we never want to do is to make it so that this takes away jobs, or this takes away opportunities. We want it to sustain and strengthen and add and show evidence of interest at a site. So the less commonly taught languages have this particular situation whereby you typically have different offerings at different universities, as long as you stay within a certain set of parameters. If you expand it up into something that's too big, then you could have a situation where you're saying, okay, we're not going to hire this person because we can get this language from this other university. Was that sort of the essence of your question, or did you mean something slightly different?
Yeah, in terms of how it works within the university as a form of teaching. And that's one aspect, the who teaches it and how much do we need someone to teach this. If we can take, for example, if I'm a university that doesn't have modern Greek and I know that I can get one course from Yale and one course from Columbia, then why would I go and hire someone if I can do that? That's part one. But part two, this started, as you said, that this started as a Mellon initiative, and now it's part of the institutions, which I think that standardization, it's really important, but how does it function in terms of the university policy now as an initiative?
Yeah, so it's functions through a memorandum of understanding that lays out in very specific detail how this all works, how what the responsibilities each university has towards the other universities are. So just to point out a few other aspects to this, and then I imagine my time is over, so I should finish. Although I have one more question. Okay, so in terms of instructors at different universities teaching the same language, one possibility that we have is that, because of the crisis and because of the loss of languages, one part that has been really affected is the advanced level or upper levels of the language. And so one could, in theory, have, if you had two instructors at two different universities, one could teach, whatever their load is, and then have perhaps one of those courses be an upper level course. And then at another university, they could teach that same load, but then have, instead of a third year course, that instructor could teach the fourth year course. So you could actually build up a more robust track or pathway for students to take the language. In so doing, you may very well attract more students to that language because they say, oh, I don't just top out at this specific level, I can go higher up. And let me also add that the idea of doing no harm is one that we take very seriously, and we have a certain degree of technical control and institutional control. And so if anytime we find ourselves in a situation where it's taking away and not adding, we just stop. And if for example, an administrator wanted to push something through, I would mess it up. I would not allow it to be very good. So I think that one further advantage is that when you have students who are, one piece of our collaborations, one piece of our MOU states that a student who starts must be able to finish their language requirement. This means that there are multiple stakeholders in any given language class. And so what this means is that if a language at a particular university experiences a crisis, an administrative crisis, an administrator saying, we don't want this anymore, the other two universities say, you can't take this away now because we have our student in here and this student needs to be able to finish. And as you may have noticed in higher education, administrative crises tend to be relatively temporally limited. Once that administrator goes and gets a job at some other prestigious university, suddenly the crisis is over. So, this is another way of that this type of collaboration can be used strategically to strengthen less commonly taught languages. Okay, I guess that's it. Thanks.
Here. What do we learn from this? Never give the microphone to another Greek. I'm happy to welcome Andrew Ross and Nelleke van Deusen-Scholl, who will just reflect a little bit on what they've heard up to now in the symposium, and then we'll open up to your questions so that we can all reflect together. Nelleke, are you going to start, or will it be Andrew? How are you going to do this?
Can you all hear me? How about now? We good? Okay. So my remarks are going to be sort of summative, looking at some of the threads that have come up during the course of the symposium. I think Nelleke is going to have many more interesting things to say, many more interesting questions to pose than I will, so pay attention to her part of the talk. I'm first of all very grateful for the opportunity to be here and to listen to all of the terrific presentations that we've had today. So it seems to me that starting off from the first keynote that context is crucial in determining how we address the crisis in second language enrollments in this country. And although we may not be able to offer a list of prescriptive best practices, we can perhaps frame a number of best processes that can help us ask useful questions on a local level and develop solutions that take into account the identities and needs of our students and the financial, structural, and political landscapes of our institutions. So we had, I think, this morning and this afternoon, some really interesting examples of moving beyond default state, and that's going to become a part of my vocabulary going forward, so thank you, Chris. So the threads that we saw really revolved around community engagement and acknowledgement of communities outside of the classroom. Space and community is crucial to student engagement, the incorporation of student academic interests beyond language acquisition, the inevitability of technology that will de-emphasize activities that can be supported through AI or other means, which leads to a refocusing on critical inquiry, soft skills, and higher cognitive tasks that machines can imitate but not undertake. And finally, a need to re-examine default statements of thinking and acting. From Barbara Spinelli's talk, I think something that we can take away is an emphasis on the global. The idea that from general principles and broad theoretical undergirding of instruction, we can adapt practice to local contexts effectively, but still in a structured, reasoned manner that really takes into account, for lack of a better word, SLA, best practices. I thought Lee Abraham's talk on incorporating lived experience in geographic and cultural context into language learning was absolutely fantastic, really, really inspiring stuff. And I think it behooves us to consider how the community, the city, the town, the campus can inform and improve language learning experiences for our students. This leads me to the concept of embeddedness, right? To what extent are institutions embedded in the communities that surround us? How do we interact with them? How do we create meaningful relationships and networks that we can leverage in support of language learning? And if we are not actively seeking and implementing those relationships, why are we not? I think the discussion also focused on developing a clear understanding of the populations that we serve. So moving from the default view of the students that enter our classes to perhaps a more nuanced view of students who come with lived experience that we sometimes don't take into account when we're developing curriculum and teaching. So curricula, I think, we should acknowledge ought to be student-focused to the extent possible and not just the default student. Community-focused, we need to exhibit a willingness to listen to our constituents and then adapt our curricula in light of local needs and aspirations. Finally, I think that Chris brings up some really, really interesting points about the default state, right? We are in a situation now where a great deal of our lives are mediated through technology. And for us to fail to acknowledge that in the classroom, in praxis, in planning, I think probably does a disservice to our students. So this brings up, of course, the question of creating more opportunities for engagement with multiliteracies for our students, and looking at the development of critical perspectives on the 21st century skills that are being inculcated. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Nelleke, and please feel free to offer correctives during the discussion and question period that will follow.
How much shorter? I don't know if you can do that. Can you hear me? All right, thanks. So I'll offer my perspectives. To some extent, I think they overlap with Andrew's, and they're not intended to be comprehensive. They're just some of my impressions of what we've been hearing so far, and we know, of course, we still have a fantastic final plenary to come. I want to start with a few observations about Per Urlaub's opening speech yesterday. I think he told us that we should move beyond thinking about simplistic solutions. And as he mentioned, best practices, that's often sort of a nugget that we can offer. And he suggested that we go to a deeper understanding of really understanding the issues and then act upon it. And he's mentioned that it should be both with urgency but also with patience. And he also reiterated that language learning, and I think we should remind ourselves of that, is at the core of the humanities. So we are in this crisis together, and we should think about issues collaboratively. Both Stefan Horitos and Lee Abraham reminded us that innovation starts with listening to the learner. We need to understand the learner, and we must really ask them what they want to learn, and then connect better with their lives and their needs. And many of the talks today have, I think, stressed that in various ways. In Jennifer Gibson's talk, she mentioned we really need to listen to their needs, but also need to listen to what employers think is relevant and connect that. Both Per Urlaub and Jennifer Gibson talked about personalizing advising, making sure that students understand what why they're engaging in language study. In my own institution, often having a language requirement means getting something out of the way, as opposed to having a thoughtful discussion about what language can be for a student in their academic career and their long-term hopes for their future careers. I also thought it was interesting that Chris Kaiser just mentioned that, in a sense, language pedagogy is not in tune with the current lives of our learners. You know, we are old fogies teaching a whole different generation who are digitally connected in ways that we are often not recognizing. And so we need to think about that differently. How do we use technology? At the same time, we also need to be careful of that. As he mentioned, you know, it divides our attention in multiple ways. However, you know, teaching in a way that was good for us 25 years ago, and I'm dating myself even beyond that, is something that we should not be doing. We should look forward with our learners. Several of the talks emphasized, and I think this is super important, the central role of identity. Barbara Spinelli mentioned that students come with their plurilingual selves and that we need to acknowledge that in the classrooms. Lee Abraham, as Andrew already mentioned, got us to think about the lived experiences of our students. Angela Lee Smith gave a really nice example of students creating narrative experiences of their life, story maps, and they layered those experiences on a map that then came to life through those experiences. And many of you talked about heritage learners that we also need to consider as a type of learner that is becoming much more, that their objectives are very different from the ones that we traditionally had to deal with. So along with that, with these different learners, come new pedagogies, innovative pedagogies that engage learners with their plurilingual environment. And these pedagogies need to include also the place and the space where that learning takes place. Barbara Spinelli gave a wonderful example of her approach to a plurilingual pedagogy, using multiple languages that students could draw upon. Angela Lee Smith talked about project-based learning within a multiliteracy framework as a way to address the complexities of our students, what our students bring to our classrooms. At the core of what a lot of you said was creating reflective learners and having them bring their own narratives into the classroom. Chris's talk about less commonly taught languages, I think, also touched on a way that we can connect students to each other, to each other's experiences across institutions. And we can thereby also empower students. I think the word empower was one that I heard echoed in many of the talks. But I heard it also in Chris's very concrete example of even having a distance classroom where students are in control of what they hear, what they see, how close they are, how distant they are, what they focus on, which is something when we talk about a student-centered classroom, when we talk about a student, powered classroom in a way in a distance environment. Andrew really already mentioned that we should think about connecting language learning with the world beyond the classroom through place, space, and community-based projects, and projects that allow students to share their cultural experiences. And I thought Chris's example of the Modern Tibetan Project was a wonderful example of doing that. Then another theme that I thought was very interesting, again in many of the talks, was that of interdisciplinarity. It came out in Per Urlaub's opening talk where he stressed that. Lee Abraham talked about when you engage the communities, you can also bring in other experts. And he mentioned, for example, sociologists and historians that can bring their expertise into a more layered understanding of what a community is like, both at the present but also through history. And Jennifer Gibson mentioned the kind of courses that connect various disciplines. She mentioned the gateway courses where there were interdisciplinary collaborations, and those offer promise for future ways where students can actually connect different interests where language plays a central role. Then many of the talks focused as well on the changing skills, the 21st century skills such as critical thinking, collaboration, creativity, multimodal competence. ACTFL has also charged us now with preparing students for a globalized world. I think those are all things we need to begin thinking about, or many of us already are, of course. I think Chris gave us a very good pause there. We also have to think of the challenges, particularly how technology shapes and divides our attention in many ways. I wanted to add two things that I thought we might want to think about as well. One is, I first wanted to ask how many graduate students are here in our audience? There are some, not enough, I think. So I think one of the things that we need to think about is how do we prepare the next generation of the professoriate to address a lot of these challenges. We are of the generation of the big divide. I'm hoping that the grad students will be the ones that bridge that divide through the new pedagogies, through new ways of thinking about the classroom. And then one final thought, it came really out of Jennifer Gibson's comment about how much learner interest really is around the world. When we look at mobile apps and technologies, there are hundreds of millions of learners on Duolingo and Babbel, and we tend to scoff at those in academia. We tend to say, well, that's just not the same. And of course, we're not claiming it's the same. However, I think we do need to think about democratization of language learning and creating greater access for learners in non-traditional environments. Per Urlaub talked about that. We need to also include K through 12, community colleges, maybe older learners for whom the collegiate environment may not be the best environment, or it may not be the only environment. So I think we need to think more broadly and collaboratively. I'll leave it at that. I think it might be good to see if there are any questions from the audience about what you've heard today, or comments about your reflections of what you feel about the contributions of our speakers over the last day.
Marian Gelkern, German Department, Yale University. Just a suggestion, maybe how to continue our collaboration. Angela nicely demonstrated her multimodal projects that are accessible to everybody. So maybe in the area of syllabus and curriculum development, we could design something similar, because if we want to get away from textbooks and try to create our own textbook-like curricula, so it would be nice to have some kind of collaboration and not to start everything from scratch. Because I think some of the ideas cover a whole semester, some are just an idea, so that would be, I think, a great continuation from what we have heard here all day and yesterday.
So I'd just like to pose a question to the audience. Are there ways in which you are now thinking about collaborating between institutions that you perhaps were not thinking about when you walked in the door this morning? And if so, what are they? And what are the ways in which either the consortium or institutions outside the consortium can facilitate those plans? I hate leaving the room without an action item.
I think Per has a question also, or a comment.
Hello, yes. Thank you so much for this wonderful synthesis of the ideas that have been floating around in this room so far over the last 2 days. One of the things that irked me a little bit is our shared assumption that if we think about innovation, especially if you think about technological innovation, that there is this idea of the digital natives and we as the digital barbarians, and that there's a generational divide between our willingness or enthusiasm, or our lack of our willingness and enthusiasm to engage with innovation, technological innovation, etc. This does not resonate 100% with my experiences or observations. One of the things that I actually see is that the fault line between people who are innovative, especially with technology, in their classroom and willing to try out new things, is not necessarily a generational or an age, on the age spectrum, but it has a lot to do with the nature of the appointment of individual instructors or professors. Overall, in contexts that I taught before, and also at Middlebury, also what I see in the year-round college, is that adjuncts, people with limited term contracts, seem to be much more innovative, much more interested in trying out new things. Maybe sometimes it's also a pressure or a perceived pressure that has to do with that. But then on the other end, I've seen people much younger than I am, but who are in tenure track or tenured situations, who don't even know how to upload a PDF on their Canvas system or something like that. I mean, that's really not a joke. I've seen that. And who are really not interested in learning it, because they told me, 5 years ago we had a different course management system and we had to learn that. And where my answer then simply is just like, yes. And in 5 years we will probably have yet another one, and another one, because there will be better things out there. But where simply the willingness to innovate, and especially in the technology area, I think has nothing to do with digital natives or digital barbarians, or with a generational gap. I think it has to do with the way the different way how appointments are structured at universities. That was not a question, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Didn't want to put anybody on the spot.
I still would encourage you to come up with an answer to maybe Andrew's question. I think it might be good if we walked away with some concrete ideas from this conference, things that you have found to be useful, things you will take away and move and act on.
Thank you. I came with very little knowledge about how a consortium works, although I've had questions about how to create one for quite a while. So it's been definitely interesting to have possible models. I have more technical questions on how it then plays out, and perhaps it becomes a little bit too administrative. But I think for us at Montclair State University, it's been fairly easy to come up with what Jennifer was talking about in terms of combining pre-existing programs, so to have a new one with business and language. So we didn't have to reinvent the wheel, we just had to create a common space, and we'll see. It'll be launched in the fall, so we are very optimistic about, of course, so we have to see how it plays out. Where I find it more challenging is in the area of translation. I know some people have brought up this point already, and has a question that connects to your question, numbers in enrollment. So what happens when you have an idea and you think that it's very promising, but there's a problem of filling the classes, right? And so you think of other institutions that are doing something similar and that are equally struggling. But what does it mean to come up with something that allows us to run these classes and respond to the expectations of the administrators? And the last point has to do with K-12. And I was wondering what the consortium has done so far in terms of reaching out to community colleges and in particular high schools. We're running a summer course for high school students. And it's a very interesting experiment, but the lack of articulation with high schools does not allow us to really build a bridge in terms of further nurturing our program.
The consortium has not engaged in any of these kind of activities, and it probably is a very good suggestion to think about that. I can give an example from Yale. We have a wonderful outreach program in the community for high school students, but the consortium has not done any such work. Maybe should.
I can speak to that a little bit from a professional organization standpoint. So I am the incoming president of IELT, which is the International Association for Language Learning Technology. And we have a reasonably active outreach program to K-12 and community college faculty members. So we offer workshops, regional groups, offer discounted access to both materials that have been produced by IELT, but also workshops and other events. But yeah, I agree with you. More needs to be done for sure. In terms of sharing courses across, so when I was at Arizona State University, we stood up a translation program that involved the University of Arizona, and essentially we were sharing students, but program-wide. So they would take one course at U of A and then perhaps two courses at ASU, all for local credit. No tuition transfer, and that actually went quite a ways towards encouraging the administration to refund and rethink a position in translation studies for us.
Perhaps last question.
This is more of a response about action items that might come out from what we've heard today and what you two so ably digested for us, postprandial digested. So my comment is on something Lisa and I were talking about, which is how do we know what students want? And how do we know what faculty members would like to do or develop? And sometimes the best way to know is to have outside people doing focus groups and emails targeted to specific groups. For example, though you have to get your dean or provost involved, but for example, students who placed out of a language requirement to see what would attract them to continue their language study, to minors to see what they would like to pursue, and similarly with focus groups with faculty that don't involve a dean or a department chair, and therefore the playing field is more level, and people can really talk, I think, in a free nature. So I just thought I would suggest that for those who want to know what do students want, organizing it in terms of a well-formulated survey to a specific group. In other words, the data question that more than one speaker has spoken of, and the value of a focus group. If you've never used a focus group, it is a really powerful technique for teasing out what the nuances are that a written survey can't. So thanks.
Let me thank Andrew and Nelleke for really stepping up and saving our bacon here. Even though I just got a message from Diane who says she's so sorry and she really wanted to be part of this and was hoping that, you know, she'd be able to present this topic at some other future iteration of the symposium. Thank you, Andrew and Nelleke.